Hey guys, Lady Locks here, and today I want to take a look at the mechanics of pin tumbler locks. With the help of this 3D printed lock from 3D Locksport, I want to take a look at different types of driver pins and different lengths of key pins and how all of that affects picking a lock. So grab yourself a snack and let's get started. First, let's take a second just to admire the craftsmanship of this 3D printed lock from 3D Locksport. This is really a great representation of what's actually going on inside of your lock. So if you're having trouble, picturing it in your mind, this is a really great tool to have. For this example, I'm going to be using these two ledges here to apply my turning force, my tension, and I'm going to be using the back of my pick as my hook. We can talk about the pin states first because I think that's pretty important to understand. So when we talk about pin states, we talk about three types of pin states. There is the springy pin, and that is the pin state right here where you're pressing up on the key pin and you kind of feel that spring tension pressing back at you. The pin presses right back down when you let it go. And that's a springy pin. So when you're picking through your lock, if you come across a pin that is springy, it obviously can't be picked because even if you did take it up to the shear line, it just falls right back down. A binding pin is a pin that has tension on it and it doesn't want to move. It's bound. So these are the pins that you're trying to pick when you're picking a lock. And when they're binding, you go ahead and pick them. The driver pin will catch on the ledge like so, and the key pin will become now kind of jiggly. And oftentimes you can hear this when you're picking through your lock. You can hear the pins kind of dangling there, and that's because the driver pin is set and there's no longer any spring tension on the key pin. Now, if this was not the last pin that needed set, there would be other pins inside the lock that would now start to bind, and then you would try to pick those. If it was the last pin to set, as soon as we pressed it up to the shear line, the core would turn and your lock would open. All locks have different sized key pins. Most times, the pin stacks are balanced, and that just means that they are all basically around the same length from the bottom of the key pin to the top of the driver would be right around the same length. So what does it mean when you have different sized key pins and different sized drivers? Well, they are going to pick differently, of course. So when there's tension on a longer driver, you really need to press up a little bit more than you would if there was just a longer key pin in there. So as you can see, when there are longer sized key pins in there, you really don't have much of the driver in there that needs picked. Now, don't let standard pins fool you. I feel like we think they're easy just because they're the first pins that we learn how to pick, but after you get started into picking different security pins, you start to get dependent on the feedback that they give you. And when you go switch back to picking something with standard pins, you soon come to realize that standard pins do not give much feedback at all. Sometimes you'll get a clicking sound, sometimes you will get a bit of core movement, but that's really all you get. You don't really get much in the way of feedback. So if you are more progressed in your picking, don't forget to go back and practice on those standard pin locks. You don't want to lose your touch on standard pins. Next, let's talk about serrated pins. Now, I found these quite difficult to learn and get the hang of. These are often found in the American 1100s and some brass body padlocks, locks that are kind of the next step after picking standard pins. So you have to get the hang of them. But they are tricky. As you move up through the serrations, you're going to get the jiggly pin, and you're going to get a click each time a serration gets set. But you may not know the difference between a click in the serration and a click when the pin sets. You need to learn the distinction between a serration setting and the pin itself setting fully. The only way to do that is by practice, guys. It's going to be tough. You might want to progressively pin a lock with serrated pins with just one or two till you get the hang of it. The only way to tell when they are set is going to be the difference in the click that you hear and the difference in the core movement that you feel. Spool pins are my absolute favorite pins to pick. They give lots of feedback and they give lots of clues on how they need to be picked. So, looking at a spool pin with a standard sized key pin, you're going to usually start picking a spool pin right here in the middle. Now, I will show you what happens when you have a shorter key pin and a longer key pin and you're picking the spool pin from different parts. But for right now, we're going to look at when you're picking it when it's in this state, where the middle of the spool pin is at the shear line. Your core will turn and you'll get into a false set. And when you get into a false set, this is what's actually happening inside the lock. So now what you need to do is you need to go ahead and feel each of the pins as you go through the lock until you feel something give you a bit of counter rotation. And counter rotation is when you can feel that core turning back a bit as you're pushing up. So that is counter rotation, and that's when you'll know that is the pin that needs picked. So as you press up on the pin and set it, you will have your open. Now for this example, I've put in the shortest key pin I've got with the 3D printed lock, and unfortunately it's just a tiny bit too short to show you this example correctly, so I'm going to pretend like our key pin is this long and that our spool pin is caught right here at this shear line. So when you apply tension to the lock, it's just going to feel like a standard pin and you're going to pick it, but it's not fully picked yet. The entire pin isn't over the shear line, so you've still got some more work to do. So as you pick through the lock and pick all the binding pins, eventually you'll get back to this one and you'll feel some counter rotation when you press up on the key pin. When you feel counter rotation, that's going to be an indicator of a spool pin that needs set the entire way. So just going to press up and finally get your spool pin to set the entire way. Alright, so for this example, we've got a very long key pin, although it's not long enough to show you the example I want to show you, so let's just pretend that it comes up to here. So you've got your spool pin, the very bottom of the spool is at the shear line. So in that case, it will just feel like a standard pin and you'll pick it and your core will turn. So those are the 3 different ways that a spool pin can act inside of a lock. But most importantly, when you're dealing with spool pins, you will most likely get some counter rotation due to the fact that the spool pin is actually at the middle part of the spool at the shear line. So when that happens, you get the counter rotation. You just know that you need to set it the entire way, and that is the basics of a spool pin. Now they are a lot of fun to pick. They're actually my favorite, but those you can find in the brass body padlocks and the American 1100s as well, and those are the next step after picking the standard pins. Alright guys, so I'm going to leave it right here for today, and I hope that you found these examples helpful. If you'd like to get one of these 3D printed locks from 3D Locksport, I'll leave a link in the description. They are very helpful when you need to picture what's happening inside of the lock. Take care guys.